for what is a very, very important event for the American Jewish community, and specifically our community here. This is an institution of Jewish education. We teach Torah. And we believe, and we teach our students accordingly, that everything they learn at one point or another will be relevant to their experience as Jews today. Yesterday we read in the Haftarah, Parashat Parah, in the prophetic reading from the 36th chapter of Ezekiel. And simply to summarize, the Navi, the prophet, makes 2 points. Number one, the Jewish people will be returned and restored to their land by the Almighty. Implicit in that point is that it is our land and we belong there. And the second point is that the Almighty is concerned, the Navi tells us, for Chilul Hashem, that we as Jews, as individuals and as a nation, sanctify God's name. And I think it's those concerns that concern all of us now. The individual who has an awesome responsibility to represent Eretz Yisrael, Dinat Yisrael, and Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, in the United Nations, sits to my left. Benjamin Netanyahu is at 38 the youngest ambassador in Israel's diplomatic corps. Before that, he served for 2 years as Israel's deputy ambassador here in Washington. And with no further ado, I give you Mr. Netanyahu.
Thank you very much. We're beginning early because I have to leave early. I can't wait to get back to the UN, you know that. But I draw a great deal of encouragement from the fact that I've been speaking to Jewish groups around the country, and I just came from a rally of 3,000 young members of the United Jewish Appeal. And I must tell you that the story is wrong in 2 ways. It's not only what you see on the nightly news, it's what you see about the reaction of American Jews on the nightly news. So it's twice wrong. And it's very encouraging for me to see how wrong it is. But I don't want to delude you. We're in a war. This is war. And what we have today is a new phase in an old war. The Arabs have tried other things. They tried regular war 5 times. They didn't succeed. They've tried terrorism between the wars. They didn't succeed. And now they're trying the strategy of anarchy and the cameras in front of that anarchy to get a trial by media. Now that's not just a trial, it's a kangaroo court, where Israel is to be hung, drawn, and quartered, and then given an unfair trial to boot. That's happening nightly. And the idea is to create this stampede, international stampede, not only in America, but around the world, to drive Israel unilaterally into those indefensible boundaries where her very life would be threatened. Now this is something that has to be understood if we're to get any headway into dealing with the 2 problems that we face. The first problem is how to restore some kind of order and tranquility to these territories. And the second is how to achieve some sort of long-term solution for them. When we talk about the first problem, the restoration of some sort of calm and tranquility, the most important thing that you have to understand about what is going on is that it is not peaceful non-violence. See, the words that people use, protests, demonstration, civil disobedience, all evoke an image as though you had a host of Mother Teresas out there carrying placards, demonstrating for human rights in a peaceful, non-violent way, and then come these brutal Israelis who brutalize them, bust them up. This is the picture. The truth is that what you have is not peaceful nonviolence, but it's very opposite. Deliberate, systematic, organized mass violence. By the way, it didn't start out that way. It started with a spontaneous combustion, but within 2 weeks, you have now in this area now for close to 3 months, a coalition of PLO on the one hand and fundamentalists on the other. Usually they kill each other, now they're united in trying to kill us. And the way they're doing it is to give instructions, very clear instructions to those people. Don't shoot. Did you see that? Have you ever seen a weapon, a Kalashnikov, a hand grenade? You think there aren't any hand grenades or Kalashnikovs out there? The reason they're not using them is because they're told not to use them. They're told not to use them. They're told to use stones, which can kill. Remember in the Bible, one of the punishments of death is to stone somebody. You can stone somebody to death. And Molotov cocktails, which can burn people alive. And slingshots, which have pieces of shrapnel that can cut a man's head off. And all sorts of techniques like that. In other words, use lethal means, but not firearms. Because lethal means less than firearms make tremendous television. And what you do is you have all these provocations. Not only against Jews, by the way, against Arab school teachers, against Arab school teachers who, every day at 11 o'clock, you're an Arab school teacher in Judea, Samaria, or in Gaza, your class or your school is entered by armed, masked men who push all the kids outside. Some of them want to go, a lot don't. Out into the streets. Get the kids out there. Because you want as many of them killed. As many as you can. This is the Khomeini tactic. In Iran, they throw them over minefields. Here, they throw them as far as you can to get casualties in these riots. Arab school teachers who say, please protect me from these people. Arab doctors who say, please protect me because I cannot evacuate wounded people. They'd rather let them die here in these inadequate hospitals than move to a hospital in Israel where they can have good treatment, in Tel Aviv or Ashkelon or anywhere else. And then Arab shopkeepers who say, please protect me because they're going to kill me if I open my shop. And they have killed, and they will kill. Violence directed against Arabs, violence directed against Jews, with the idea of collapsing the entire area into anarchy. Now, I'm not a lawyer, thank God, but I do know a little about international law. And international law says, and common sense says, the first obligation of any government is to restore, maintain and restore order. And they don't care whether this government is a military government or a civilian government, whether the area is contested or disputed. The first obligation of a government is the maintenance of law and order. And what we're doing is trying to do what anyone here would do. If you walked out of here right now, and there would be thousands of teenagers egged on by adults in the back, and they'd be stoning your car, they'd be firebombing you, they'd be trying to kill you with all these, they try to kill you with all these means that I just described. What are you going to do? Well, you know what you're going to do. You're going to scream for the police. And the police would come and they'd be outnumbered. What do you think they'd do? They'd call the National Guard. And the National Guard would come. And they'd face these street gangs. What do you think they'd do? They'd fire probably some tear gas. That doesn't work. They'd fire some rubber bullets. That doesn't work. And then if their lives were in jeopardy, they'd probably fire a few shots, live rounds. What do you mean they'd probably? You know what happened in this country. You had riots here. Far lesser provocations. Riots that involved not an attempt to collapse all order in this country, but looting in a few major cities. You lost not 80 people over 4 months. You lost 150 people in a much shorter period. What about Great Britain, the mother of the modern democracy? It has had riots. Riots in Britain itself and riots in Northern Ireland. Far lesser provocations. 12 people killed in one day. France, student demonstrations. Well, I was sitting in the Security Council, and I had attacks against Israel. And one of the attacking countries was, well, I'm not talking about the Arabs who slaughter each other with happy abandon with great numbers. I'm not talking about them. Their accusations don't particularly interest me. But the representative of India got up and he said, Israel is using excessive violence. very brutal. I said, you're the one to talk. In the Golden Temple, in one day, your troops killed 400 people. Then I got these irate letters from the Sikhs, and they said, not 400, 800. And I have to tell you, this is a common misconception. People say, but you're not like the Arabs. You always want to be held to a higher standard, right? Of course. Of course we're not like the Arabs. Because if we did to the Arabs what they do to each other, this would have been over in an hour. This is not hypothetical. Arab governments controlled these territories before we did. And they had riots, by the way. You think these are the first riots in the Arab? 1921, there were riots. 1929, there were riots. They destroyed the entire Jewish community in Hebron, community that lived there from time immemorial. 1936, there were riots that lasted for 3 years. And there were riots under the Arabs. That is, under Jordan and under Egypt. And you know what they did? Every time they have one of these things, they'd bring the Jordanian Legion, or the Egyptian army in Gaza, line up the troops, take out the machine guns, just fire away, and 50, 60 people killed in 1 hour, and that's the end of it. If we did to the Arabs what they do to each other, this would be over in 1 minute. Now, I'm not saying that we want to be held to that standard. On the contrary, I say by all means, hold us to a higher standard. But what we deserve is to be treated like a democracy, a leading democracy, no more and no less. Israel expects and deserves to be held to a double standard, but not a triple one. That's the first point about the nature of these disturbances. And I must tell you, our kids out there, facing these mobs, which stone them, stab them, burn them, urinate on them, heap buckets of human excrement on them, come and taunt them and say, you can't do anything to me, along with a few other epithets that they hurl at them. You can't do anything to me because you can't shoot me. And I know you can't shoot me. And I've got a camera here to make sure that you don't shoot me. And in addition, I'm doing this for the camera. Now, do some of our people lose control? It's happened. Relatively small number. Sure, it's happened. And what do we do when that happens? We put them on trial, we investigate, we punish them, we jail. We don't hide it. All the world sees. Unfair or not. The important thing, let's get some context here. We're not discussing right now the fairness of it. We're discussing the allegations, the assertions, the charges against Israel. And to be preached morality for the Israeli army that is acting against fantastic provocations. Fantastic provocations. For the Israeli army to try to contend with the situation as it has, in the way that it has, to be accused of immorality by the Qaddafis, Khomeinis, and Arafats of the world, or for that matter, by the nightly news reports, is a triple, and I'm going to go even as far as to say a quadruple standard that applies nowhere else in the world and certainly doesn't apply in the case of Israel. That's the first point to keep in mind. Now the second point is, why do people say it? Why do they say it? I mean, why do they all join the stampede? Now part of it, we know part of the reason. Sure. It's the age-old reason, and if you take a crack at the Jewish state, or the Jews, you can paint them as not the victims, but as the aggressors, not the recipient of aggressions, but the deliverers of aggression. It's very useful. But there's something else there. I think it's related to what people think about the long-term question, what the long-term or the root cause of the problem is. They say, look, whatever Israel does, even if it behaves nobly, even if it responds in a way that any humane army or humane government would do, whatever Israel does is a priori judged wrong because Israel's presence in that area is wrong. And whatever the Arabs do is judged right because removing this unjust presence is by definition right. So if the ends are just, then the means of the Arabs are just. And if Israel's ends are unjust, then Israel's means are unjust. By the way, this is a very dangerous type of thinking because ends and means should always be kept separate. But let's separate them out and let's talk about ends. Let's talk about what is this battle all about. Is it about Judea, Samaria, and Gaza? Well, that's what they say. They say, look, the occupation, as they call it, is the root of all evil. And this thing has been simmering for 20 years. And if you get out of there, you end the occupation, as they say, you end the problem. Now, of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict did not begin in 1967. And our presence in those territories is not the cause of our conflict with the Arabs. It's a result of the conflict with the Arabs. And this question of the territories is many things. It's complex. There are a lot of problems that have to be resolved with it. But whatever they are, they're quite complex. They are not the root cause of this. Because what the Arabs are doing, and they're doing this daily on the nightly news, every night, they're using a reversal of causality. They're turning the cause into the effect, and the effect into the cause. Now, it's not the first time they did it. In the first 20 years of the state, they said, the reason you have the Arab-Israeli conflict is because of refugees. But there wasn't a single refugee, Arab refugee, in 1948 when they attacked the Jewish state. That wasn't the reason either. It's the same thing here. There wasn't a single Israeli soldier in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza when they attacked us from these very territories. Well, maybe it's because the Arabs, the Palestinians, lacked a state. Well, they were offered a state in 1947. They rejected it out of hand. They just went after the Jewish state. And you say, well, that was 40 years ago. That was 40 years ago. They've changed since then. Did you see the program 48 Hours, CBS 48 Hours?
Yeah.
See if I have this. Yeah, I do. That's my speech. Correspondent interviewing 7 ringleaders of these riots. They're sitting on a beach in Gaza next to a campfire. It's like a kumsitz of these guys. And he asked them, if you get a state on the West Bank and Gaza, will this be enough? Answer. Palestine is indivisible. Haifa, Akko, Jaffa, Galilee, Nazareth. All these are parts of Palestine. So the Israelis are right, correspondent says. Because what I'm hearing is that a state of Israel, a Jewish state run by Jews, governed by Jews, for Jews, cannot exist. Answer. No. 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 Unacceptable. I want Palestine. All of it. Entirely. What he's saying is merely echoing what the fundamentalists are saying and what the PLO is saying, who are both egging him on. The PLO, as you know, is an umbrella organization, and everybody says, well, the mainstream of the PLO, the Fatah, they're reasonable. Why? They don't say these things. Well, maybe not in English. But I'll tell you what they say. The Fatah's last convention had a resolution, and they said, our objective, this is word for word, our objective is the liberation of all of Palestine, which they conveniently define to include modern Israel. And it further goes on to say, and it is the destruction of the Zionist entity, morally, militarily, spiritually, ideologically, culturally. Not a stone to be left. The destruction of the Zionist entity. There's not even a glimmer of a hope for peace there. And what we have, and the problem that we're facing with these riots, is the continuation of the same problem that we had all along. The genesis of the Arab-Israeli conflict is what continues it today. And it is not that the Arabs lack a state, but that the Jews have one. This is the problem. Because I must tell you, if the grievances were refugees, we would have solved it. If there were borders, we wouldn't have had the border problems, and even so we could have solved it. If there were territory, difficult, but we could have solved it too. We've seen in this century solutions to problems of refugees 20 times, 100 times bigger in every nation, almost in every nation in war-torn Europe. And we ourselves absorbed a greater number of Jewish refugees from Arab lands without endless petrodollars and endless territory. And territories and boundaries, we've had these settlements. We've had them. We could have had them here as well. The reason you're not progressing, and we haven't progressed, is because of this attitude. That's the root cause of the conflict. And every night on the nightly news, that lie is perpetrated again and again and again. And the truth is obscured by one more report, by one more veil that is put, one more layer of falsification and distortion every night. Now, I will tell you that we are facing the battle for Israel. And the 40th anniversary of Israel, we can sit back and we can say, well, we've done a lot of things. And we've had great achievements. We have had great achievements. We've had achievements in rolling back the onslaught of the Arab armies 5 times. We had achievements in building a state, building an economy, building theaters, universities, concert hall. Built and rebuilt our culture, our traditions, our faith, and our language, which I think is a tremendous achievement. Taking an ancient language like that and turning it into a modern instrument and yet retaining its ancient beauty. We've done what no people has done, but we're not finished. Because the central issue that we're facing today remains the battle for Israel's survival. And the question, of course, is, what are you going to do? What are we going to do? We have learned one thing throughout our history. And we've had a battle not for 40 years. That's the blinking of an eye in the life of an ancient nation. We've been living for 3,500 years as a nation. And we've had unsurpassed agonies and unsurpassed triumphs. And we've learned one thing. No one will defend us if we don't defend ourselves. No one. And that defense has to be a twofold defense. It is not enough to defend against the physical onslaught. It is also equally important, sometimes even more important, to defend against the verbal, and may I add today, the visual onslaughts. Because those are onslaughts. Those onslaughts form the fodder of slander. And if you don't have slander, you don't really have the prelude to destruction. We've learned in our history, not only in this century, in every century, that slander and vilification and vituperation is a necessary accompaniment to the destruction of our people. And what you're seeing today is a new kind of vilification, a new kind of slander. So when I say we have to fight back, that's a twofold assault, a counterattack. A physical one, sure, when we're attacked, but also a verbal one when we are attacked every night. And for that we have to mobilize the resources that we have. I know that Pat Robertson is not running here in Silver Spring, but he used the term secret army, and I hate to borrow this, but you are a secret army. You are a secret army. And that means that in every community, you form truth squads. You form truth squads. And you write to the media, you write to that newspaper, you write to that publisher, you write to that producer, you write to that reporter, because you have the facts. And if you need the facts, if you don't have it, we'll give it to you. But let them feel the pressure. Because one of the things that they would like to see is the Jews split, the Jews divided, and to believe that a fraction of the Jews who have criticized Israel all along anyway and are using this opportunity now, that they speak for half the community. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing. But the truth has to be seen. It has to be heard. And it's our common responsibility to make it seen and to make it heard. I think that on this 40th anniversary of Israel, we've recaptured, more than anything else, in the rebirth of the Jewish state, we recaptured the capacity of the Jewish people to resist, the capacity of the Jewish people to defend themselves against assault. And that is not something that is over, or will be over, perhaps ever. When the founders of modern Zionism founded the Jewish state and talked about the Jewish state, they didn't say that the Jewish people would stop being assaulted by their enemies. They merely said, by having the Jewish state, they will be able to resist assaults of the kind that they've had throughout the generations. And that has proved to be such a prophetic and prescient statement. Because without a Jewish state, the Jewish people lost 1/3 of their numbers in this century alone, as they did in other centuries, by the way. And without a Jewish state, not only would Israel not be able to protect itself, but I think that the Jewish communities around the world would disintegrate into oblivion, lacking not only the capacity for political, and sometimes, when necessary, a military defense that can come with the Jewish state, but also the spiritual center and the vital center that gives coherence to communities around the world. Now, we almost died in this century. We almost died, a final death. Because everybody said, well, the Holocaust made the Jewish state. Nonsense. The Holocaust almost destroyed the Jewish state. In the race between the anti-Semites and the Zionists, the anti-Semites almost won. And we barely made a state there. And then we built it up and we defended it. And now we have that center. But that center could dissipate unless we do something about it. We have to protect it. We have to nourish it, because it will determine whether the Jewish people, not only the Jewish state, live or die. And there is an assault taking place right now, a war that is being waged right now, that is perhaps the most insidious, the most cunning, the most dangerous war that we have fought so far. And what I've come here today is to say a simple thing. You get up right now. It's not an order, and it's not a request. It's a simple statement, talking to Jews who care about the Jewish future. Get up right now. Make your voices heard. On Capitol Hill, in the media, in your synagogues, and to your friends. This is the time for Jews to get up and be counted. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes for questions. Please identify yourselves.
Yes, my name is Jeff Rubin. Ambassador Netanyahu, Israel is now being asked to trade territory for peace. How would you respond to that request, and in such a way as not to, let's say, endanger American-Israel relations?
Did you hear the question? What about the formula, the exchange of territory for peace? The interesting thing is that request is being put only towards Israel. You notice that? Nobody asked the Arabs to trade territorial claims for peace. Nobody said you should declare, Hussein, before we get into the negotiation, that you will relinquish some of the territorial claims that you have as a preconditioning to enter the table. You notice this? Actually, it's a remarkable asymmetry. For God's sake, he used these territories to launch a war that was aimed at our destruction. And he assumes the mantle of the aggrieved party. Now, it has been perhaps the first break of history that the Jewish people, the Jewish state, offered after 1967 to enter negotiations. We said we have our claims on this territory, on the Sinai as well, but we're willing to negotiate. This was the position of the government. Not to concede in advance. We're willing to enter a negotiation. You have your maximalist demands? Fine, you come to the table. We come with our maximalist demands. But when one side is being pressured, Israel, to make concessions in advance, in the Congress and elsewhere, and the other side, which remains the real obstacle to a resolution of this conflict, is not being pressured, then I'd say that the mere posing of that question to Israel pushes peace and the prospects for peace further away. Go ahead.
My name is Nathan Conrad. How could there be peace in our lifetime without negotiations with the parties that we don't care for?
You mean the PLO?
Yeah.
How can you have peace if you don't negotiate with the PLO? This is the common construction that they say. You have to make peace is made with your enemies, they say, and the enemy is the PLO, and whether you like them or not, you got to negotiate with them. You hear that often? I hear that about 20 times more often than you do. Close to average. Now, you can negotiate with your enemy if what you're negotiating is a resolvable grievance. But if the grievance is your very existence, what are you going to negotiate about? The method of your execution or your decapitation or what? In other words, you can get around the table and negotiate anything as long as what you're negotiating is not your very being around a table or being, period, in the world. Think things are negotiable in the matter of the Arab-Israeli conflict, except the existence of Israel. Now, since the PLO is committed to the destruction of Israel, by the way, I don't think that people understand how it's committed to the destruction of Israel. It's committed, first of all, constitutionally to the destruction of Israel. It has a constitution, they call it, the PLO Covenant, Palestine National Covenant. And this PLO constitution says that the aim of this movement, as they call it, is the obliteration of the Zionist entity. They're quite candid about it. Not only that, they also prescribe the way to do it, what they call the armed struggle, or what we call terrorism. Now, when you have an outfit that is committed to your destruction, what you can have is only the means to legitimize that goal, and we're not about to give them those means. And I must say, try to think of it in American terms. See, America, for example, doesn't even get to that point. It says, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And the PLO certainly are terrorists. We're not going to negotiate with the Puerto Rican FLN. No way, we don't negotiate with terrorists. In the British state, we're not going to negotiate with the IRA. No way. We're not going to negotiate with terrorists. They're right. And the Spaniards say, we're not going to negotiate with the Basque ETA because we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And they're absolutely right. The PLO makes all these little terrorists look even smaller because it is the quintessential terrorist organization of our time. But the difference is this. This is a terrorist organization that is committed to the destruction of a state, avowedly committed. Now, the IRA does not try to destroy Britain. And the Puerto Rican FLN does not try to say America should go into the Atlantic. But if it did, or if any one of those terrorist organizations did, and you told Margaret Thatcher, or you told George Shultz, negotiate with one of these terrorist organizations. Negotiate with a terrorist organization that seeks the destruction of America and says, give me as a first step the Rockies. You would say, out. No way we'll do it. You're saying no way under lesser circumstances. Israel is the only country in the world which is asked to negotiate with those who would liquidate her. Now let me take one more moment on this because it's important. It's not merely unfair. It's dangerous. Because if the PLO can use the negotiating process to get a foothold in the Rockies, our Rockies, then when they stand in the 67 boundaries, what they'll do is not throw rocks at us, but throw rockets. Now I hear that in the age of missiles, territory doesn't count. Well, let me tell you something. In the age of missiles, we've had a war. It's called the Yom Kippur War. Had that war begun in the 1967 boundaries, and not in the present boundaries, Israel wouldn't exist. Because the distance that the Syrians moved and the distance that the Egyptians moved, transcribed on the 67 boundaries would mean that they would have gotten to the sea. Did any of you fly to Israel? Did any of you not fly to Israel? Can I see a show of hands? How many people have been to Israel? Wow. Well, that's terrific. Make your trip this week. Look, you know, our tourism hasn't declined so far. And I figured out the reason. Every journalist in the world, but I want to supplant that flow with your flow. I think that would be tremendous solidarity. Let me just say, if you flew to Israel, the plane that you flew in would not be able to land in Israel in the 67 boundaries, because unlike 20 years ago, you have shoulder-fired missiles. And you give it to 10,000 kids there, something this big. And they sit on those hills, looking down at that airfield. And there's not, that plane is a sitting duck. Not only that plane, all of our military airfields, you don't have that many. A very small number, and I don't need even my two hands. Every one of those airfields is covered by this kind of fire and artillery shelling, and even sometimes just straight rifle fire. So none of our Air Force planes could take off or land. None of our induction centers where we have 3/4 of our army mobilized in the first 48 hours, all of that will be subject to ground fire and rocket fire. All of that. And that's people sitting on hills. They don't have batteries because in the age of missiles, little missiles can be put close to an area. Big missiles are distant. And they have batteries, they have formations, they have concrete bunkers, but they can be hit, and they're not very accurate. And even if they are, they're identifiable targets. And you don't have that many. But you can pepper those mountains of Judea, Samaria, overlooking our 3 cities, with people sitting with this type of technology. That's the end of Israel. That's the end of Israel. So if we give the PLO the means to use these territories again for a war of destruction, it is not inconceivable that this time they may succeed. Because the technology has made the territory more necessary, not less necessary. And that the Arabs understand very well. Now let me say one other thing, because I have to make a claim, which I'm sure will fly safely. It's very easy for Americans, even for some American Jews, to say, what the hell? What do you need this thing? What do you need these territories? Get rid of them. Get rid of them. Get out. It's very easy to say that maybe in Beverly Hills. I was talking to somebody on the television the other night who was in Beverly Hills, or in Washington, D.C. It's a lot harder for me to say that to my daughter in Jerusalem, who would be living 1 mile from the PLO border. And it's for us to say it. Now let me close by the simple observation that this situation is a headache. There's no question about it. And it needs to be resolved. And I believe it could be resolved. I believe if we had people who removed the existential grievance, who said, I'm willing to sit down and make peace with Israel, directly without any of these circumlocutions, then seemingly intractable problems could be solved. Complex, difficult, but they could be solved. If we had that. And until we have it, we're going to have the headache. But the key thing to understand is, when you've got a headache, you don't cut your head off. Thank you.
Very good. Worth all that work. It's worth it. I hope this is all correct. Yeah, sure.